Good afternoon. Welcome back. Today, we embark on a quick tour of the StyleGAN family architectures. We'll walk through how StyleGANs are designed and what sets each version apart, illustrated with clear visual examples. StyleGANs are a family of image generating models that learn from large collections of images and then synthesize new photorealistic samples. We'll see how different parts of the system control texture, color, and shape, and how these knobs enable creative and scientific exploration. By the end, you will have a solid sense of the family and why researchers and artists alike care about these models. Today, we'll take a guided tour through the StyleGAN family. We'll start with generative adversarial networks, or GANs, and think of them as two players, a generator trying to craft convincing images and a discriminator trying to spot fakes. Then we'll explore the origins of StyleGAN and how it evolved from earlier work. Next, StyleGAN architecture explained how style is mapped, how features are injected at different layers, and how the synthesis network builds the final image. After that, StyleGAN 2 enhancements deliver crisper, more natural looking results. Then, StyleGAN 2 ADA, adaptive discriminator augmentation, adds data tricks so the model learns well with smaller datasets. StyleGAN 3 addresses spatial artifacts and misalignments. We'll also cover the core StyleGAN concepts, style control and latent spaces, and wrap with applications and impact. Finally, a summary and key takeaways. Now that we've introduced the idea of GANs, let's peek under the hood and watch how the two networks train together. Picture a generator sketching from random seeds, with a discriminator steadily judging whether a picture could be real. Through this back and forth, the generator learns to produce ever more convincing images with real-world outcomes like photosynthesis, style transfer, and data augmentation powering art, design, and games. But real systems aren't perfect. The next slides unpack three big hurdles in traditional GANs: mode collapse, where diversity fades; training instability, where balance tips and learning stalls; and lack of control over output styles, which can surprise us. We'll also touch on how researchers respond bigger networks, tempered loss balancing, and conditional generation to regain control and reliability, followed by practical ways to compare models and run experiments. Having covered the core training loop, we now turn to three intertwined concerns that researchers care about: stabilization, robust evaluation, and responsible deployment of GANs in real-world tasks. First, stabilization and convergence. Two ideas have become standard tools. Spectral normalization constrains the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator by rescaling its weight matrices, which helps prevent the discriminator from becoming too strong and destabilizing the generator's learning signal. Complementarily, gradient penalties, most notably the Wasserstein GAN with gradient penalty, enforce smoother, more meaningful gradients by penalizing deviations from the unit gradient norm. Together, these techniques reduce mode collapse, promote more consistent improvements, and make training less brittle to hyperparameter choices. In practice, you typically see cleaner progress curves and higher quality outputs when these constraints are in place. Second, evaluation and measurement. Beyond subjective visual assessment, we rely on quantitative metrics to compare models and track progress. The Fréchet inception distance feed has become a go-to because it compares the real and generated distributions in a learned feature space, capturing both quality and diversity. Inception score remains informative for certain setups, but it can miss mode coverage. Researchers also use precision recall plots in feature space to gauge how well the generator covers the data manifold without producing many artifacts. Perceptual or MSSSIM based metrics can help assess structural fidelity, especially in super resolution or stylization tasks. It's important to combine metrics with human judgments and, when applicable, task-specific downstream performance e.g. data augmentation improvements for a classifier. Third, hybrid models and architectural advances. Hybridization with other generative paradigms such as VAEs, VA-GAN, or diffusion-guided variants can fuse the strengths of latent structure and sharpness. Style-based generators, StyleGAN family, offer disentangled, controllable, latent representations that benefit style, transfer, and subject-aware synthesis. Progressive growing and conditioning enable high-resolution outputs with improved stability. In specialized domains, conditional GANs steer generation by label or attribute, enabling precise control over the produced content. There is also growing interest in integrating perceptual losses or cycle consistency constraints to align outputs with domain-specific characteristics. Fourth, practical considerations. Data quality and bias are critical. Biased training data can propagate harmful or overstated representations. To mitigate this, researchers deploy detectors that try to identify synthetic data and employ rigorous validation on external datasets. When possible, they evaluate not only the realism of samples but their usefulness for real tasks, such as aiding image reconstruction, improving a downstream model, or facilitating medical decision support. To sum up, the dance between generator and discriminator now includes stability, enforcements, principled evaluation, and hybrid architectures. When orchestrated carefully, these elements yield GANs that are not only impressive in appearance but reliable, controllable, and better suited for scholarly and real-world use. Building on the core challenges we've identified, we now turn to advanced mechanisms that researchers deploy to stabilize training, improve fidelity, and restore control over GAN outputs. Rather than rehashing basics, I'll outline concrete techniques, how they work, and how we evaluate them in practice. First, Lipschitz control and spectral normalization. A central issue is unstable gradient flow between the generator and discriminator. Spectral normalization constrains the spectral norm largest singular value of each layer in the discriminator, effectively bounding its Lipschitz constant. This yields more predictable gradients, reduces training oscillations, and often allows for deeper, more expressive discriminators without sacrificing stability. In practice, SNGANs demonstrate steadier convergence and smoother loss landscapes, which translates into more reliable progress over training epochs. Second, gradient penalties and the Wasserstein perspective. Gradient penalty methods, as introduced in WGA and GP, enforce a soft constraint on the gradient norm of the critic with respect to interpolated inputs. This approach aligns the optimization with the Wasserstein distance, yielding meaningful, non-saturating loss signals and substantially improving stability, particularly in high-capacity settings. Beyond WGA and GP, researchers have explored alternate penalties and two timescale update rules to balance the learning rates of generator and discriminator, reducing the tendency of one side to outrun the other. Third, robust evaluation and what it tells us about diversity and fidelity. The freshest inception distance, FID, remains the leading widely adopted metric for evaluating realism and diversity in generated batches. It tracks the distance between feature distributions of real and synthetic images, offering a single, interpretable figure. Complementary metrics, kernel added distance, KIT, precision recall analysis for generative models, and perceptual quality scores help diagnose whether improvements come from sharper details, mode coverage, or merely higher fidelity but less diverse samples. Crucially, evaluation should be protocol-driven. Fix the feature extractor, pre-compute statistics on a representative real set, and report confidence intervals over multiple seeds and runs. Fourth, hybrid and controllable architectures. Hybrid models, such as VAE GANs or conditional GANs, fuse complementary strengths to address both fidelity and interpretability. Infogan-style objectives promote disentangled representations, enabling explicit control over factors like texture, pose, or lighting. Style-based generators, as in style GAN variants, offer nuanced control over output style and locality by injecting style information at multiple layers. These designs illustrate how combining probabilistic and adversarial objectives can yield both high-quality images and steerable outputs. Fifth, practical design, choices, and experiments. Track TTUR-driven training dynamics, monitor both diversity and fidelity over time, and perform ablations to isolate the impact of spectral normalization, gradient penalties, or conditioning. When reporting results, pair quantitative metrics with qualitative analysis, and, where possible, human judgments to capture perceptual quality nuances. As we move from the basics of GANs, this next section zooms in on a turning point, style GAN, which lets us sculpt images by style as well as content. We'll unpack how a mapping network translates random inputs into style codes and how adaptive instance normalization injects those styles into every layer. You'll hear how style mixing lets us braid traits from different pictures, producing combinations like new eyes with different hair, while noise adds the tiny details that keep things looking real. We'll also cover progressive growing, the training strategy that builds resolution step by step to keep learning smooth. Finally, we'll talk through what this enables photorealistic faces, landscapes, or artwork and the responsibility that comes with it, including ethics and misuse. In short, mapping, addition, and progressive growth together give controllable, high-quality images to explore in coming slides. Building on the idea that StyleGAN gives us control over style at multiple levels, we can deepen our discussion by looking at how we stabilize training, evaluate results rigorously, and extend these ideas with hybrid or augmented architectures. First, stabilization matters as we push for higher fidelity and more reliable style control. Two techniques have become especially influential. Spectral normalization constrains the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator by normalizing its weight matrices spectral norms. This simple constraint helps prevent the discriminator from becoming too powerful too quickly, which in turn stabilizes the generator's learning signal. On top of that, gradient penalties popularized by GAN GP and related variants enforce smooth, meaningful gradients by encouraging the network to behave in a Lipschitz continuous way across interpolations in data space. Together, these tools reduce mode, collapse, and oscillations, making it easier to train complex style-based generators without resorting to exhaustive hyperparameter sweeps. Second, robust evaluation is essential as we seek to quantify both realism and diversity. The Frischeth inception distance, or FID, has emerged as a standard metric. It compares real and generated image distributions in a learned feature space, capturing both quality and variety. It improves on single image scores by accounting for distributional alignment, though it is not perfect and can be sensitive to dataset shifts. Complementary measures like the kernel inception, distance, GAN, and perceptual metrics such as LPIPS provide additional angles on fidelity and perceptual similarity. It's also prudent to report more than one metric and to couple quantitative scores with qualitative assessment, especially when pushing for new styles or rare combinations. Be mindful of potential biases in the feature extractors and ensure proper calibration on your domain. Third, about hybrids and extensions. Beyond pure GANs, researchers explore VAE GAN hybrids to fuse latent structure with adversarial sharpness and diffusion augmented generators that combine the sample quality of GANs with the tractable likelihoods of probabilistic models. In StyleGAN lineage, practitioners experiment with improvements like path length regularization and refined weight demodulation to further reduce artifacts and improve controllability. Multiscale discriminators and conditioning signals enable more faithful rendering of textures and lighting when stylistic attributes are varied. Ethics remain central. Powerful realism raises risks of misuse. Establish clear guidelines, include watermarking or provenance signals when appropriate, and ensure responsible deployment, especially for identity-sensitive applications. In short, the advancement from 18-based style control to stabilized training, rigorous evaluation, and responsible hybrids has broadened what StyleGAN can achieve while inviting careful, thoughtful use. Building on the components you outlined, there are several advanced threads researchers routinely bring into StyleGAN-like systems to improve stability, control, and evaluability without abandoning the core ideas of mapping, editing, and progressive growth. First, consider regularization that directly constrains how information flows through the network. Spectral normalization is one widely used technique that bounds the Lipschitz constant of each layer by constraining the spectral norm of its weight matrix. In the StyleGAN pipeline, applying spectral normalization or related norm-based constraints helps keep the mapping to styles pathway from producing abrupt style jumps when mixing codes across layers. This is especially valuable when you perform aggressive style mixing or push the latent variables toward highly entangled regions of the intermediate space. Complementarily, gradient penalties such as R1 divided by R2 penalties on the discriminator smooth the loss landscape, reducing sharp gradients that can destabilize training. When used judiciously with StyleGAN style architectures, these penalties can improve convergence and sample consistency, though they must be balanced to avoid dampening details or reducing image fidelity. Second, quantitative evaluation becomes essential as models scale and controls become more nuanced. The Frischeth inception distance remains a standard benchmark for realism and diversity, capturing how close the generated distribution is to the real data in a learned feature space. The kernel inception distance KID offers an unbiased alternative that can be informative on smaller datasets. Perceptual metrics such as LPIPS assess how perceptually close a generated image is to a reference, useful for gauging the effects of style edits and cross-domain transfers. Researchers also monitor training time signals like the path length statistics introduced in StyleGAN 2 to ensure smooth, predictable changes in the mapping space as you traverse latent directions. Together, these metrics provide a multifaceted view of quality, diversity, and controllability beyond subjective judgment. Third, beyond pure GANs, hybrid architectures are increasingly influential. One direction is to couple style GAN style generators with diffusion or diffusion-inspired refinement steps, using the style codes as priors or conditioning signals to steer the diffusion process. This can yield higher frequency detail and more faithful texture while preserving the controllable style manipulation afforded by the mapping network and ADA-IN. Another avenue is integrating CLIP-based conditioning or text-to-image guidance to enable semantic style editing at a higher level, effectively marrying structured style control with flexible multimodal prompts. These hybrids illustrate a practical path forward. Keep the explicit, interpretable style space and layer in complementary generative mechanisms to push realism, diversity, and control. In short, the core ideas mapping to controllable style, aiding blending, and progressive growing stability remain the foundation. Layered on top, spectral norm constraints, gradient penalties, robust evaluation, and thoughtful hybrids equip StyleGAN-based systems for rigorous research, responsible deployment, and richer creative applications. Imagine building an image as a conversation between two parts of a system. First, the mapping network takes a random vector and moves it into a space where traits can be controlled. Then, the synthesis network draws the image layer by layer, with style injected at each step and small noises adding texture without changing the subject. ADIN lets us tweak mood by adjusting means and variances of feature maps, so color and lighting shift while shapes stay put. On the other side, the discriminator design pushes realism through adaptation and staged growing, guiding the generator to improve. In the slides that follow, we'll zoom into how the mapping space clarifies what changes are possible, how style injection and noise shape texture, and how ADIN keeps content stable as style evolves. We'll also dissect adaptive discriminators and the role of progressive growing with practical examples you can compare and test. Building on the core idea you already heard, we can view this architecture through a few richer lenses that highlight training, stability, controllability, and evaluation. The mapping network still translates a latent input into a controllable space, but in practice, practitioners often extend this idea with a per layer or W plus representation. Instead of a single style vector for all layers, you obtain a dedicated style vector for each synthesis layer, enabling much finer per layer control over attributes. This strengthens disentanglement. Color, texture, and core structure can be adjusted independently at different depths without unintended cross effects. Turning to the synthesis network, the style injection remains central, but we can discuss stabilization and regularization more explicitly. Style-based generators often employ adaptive instance normalization, channel-wise scaling, and demodulation mechanisms to modulate feature statistics. To keep training robust, researchers apply spectral normalization mainly to the discriminator, ensuring the Lipschitz constraint that helps stabilize adversarial gradients. In addition, gradient penalties such as R1 divided by R2 penalties on real or fake samples regularize the gradient of the discriminator, smoothing the optimization landscape and reducing sharp, unstable updates. Beyond stabilization, several regularizers tie the latent to image mapping to perceptual reality. Path length regularization, for example, encourages a smooth, monotonic relationship between latent changes and pixel space changes in the generated images. In practical terms, small latent perturbations should yield correspondingly small and coherent changes in the output, aiding both controllability and robustness. Evaluation deserves explicit attention. Frequent inception distance remains a standard for comparing the distribution of generated features to real data, capturing fidelity and diversity jointly. Complementary metrics like KID, kernel inception distance, and LPIPS, perceptual similarity, help quantify diversity and perceptual differences more finely. When you're tuning a hybrid or extended model, report a suite of metrics to reveal both quality and variety, and consider perceptual path length measurements to assess how changes in the latent space translate into image space changes. Hybrid and extension ideas are common in current practice. You might combine the style-based generator with diffusion-inspired refinements for finer texture realism, or integrate vector-quantized autoencoders to compress and remodel the latent space. Truncation tricks can trade fidelity for diversity in a controlled way while maintaining disentanglement at higher fidelity regions of the latent space. Adaptive Instance Normalization, or ADA-AN, offers a practical and precise handle on style within deep networks. In many generative and stylization pipelines, the backbone work happens inside feature maps, the internal representations that organize color, texture, and lighting across layers. ADAIN achieves style control by adjusting the statistical properties of these maps, their means and variances. When we modify these statistics, we tilt the image's appearance, colors, contrasts, and textures without displacing the underlying spatial layout. To illustrate, imagine a beach scene with warm sunlight. ADAIN can shift the palette toward oranges and golds while keeping the shoreline and people in their original positions, preserving recognizability. The conceptual story is simple and useful. We separate content from style. Content corresponds to the shapes, layout, and structure that viewers rely on for recognition. Style encompasses color, texture, and lighting cues that shape mood. ADIN blends these by conditioning the content features on style statistics. In practice, we pass a content feature map through a normalization step that centers and scales it, then re-anchor it with the per-channel statistics derived from a style input. The result preserves the content structure while adopting the target style's character. From a technical perspective, the style is delivered as a style vector or a set of per-channel statistics. ADIN computes, for each channel, the content features mean and standard deviation, normalizes the channel, and then scales and shifts using the style's per-channel mean and standard deviation. This per-channel operation gives you fine-grained, interpretable control over how much the style reshapes the appearance. Importantly, you can tune the strength of the style influence, effectively interpolating between pure content and full style to suit the task at hand. This mechanism unlocks rapid exploratory workflows. In practice, researchers assemble galleries of styles and swap them into the same content, generating diverse renditions while keeping facial identity or object layout intact. It works well for both artistic projects and machine-driven applications, including real-time style transfer and data augmentation. However, be mindful of limitations. Extreme style shifts can distort fine content cues, and preserving high-level semantics may require careful network design and losses that balance content fidelity with stylistic change. In short, ADAIN offers a modular, interpretable, and computationally light path to precise style control. Understanding it helps you imagine new images faster for both scientific inquiry and artistic exploration. Today, we extend our discussion of discriminator design beyond fixed pixel-only scrutiny to a set of techniques that make the critic more expressive, stable, and attuned to style and structure at multiple scales. The goal is not merely to say real versus fake, but to shape the generator's learning signal so that it captures both texture-level fidelity and global stylistic coherence. First, multi-scale and patch-based discriminators. Rather than a single monolithic critic, we deploy discriminators that operate at several resolutions and focus on local patches. This patch GAN style approach complements global cues and is particularly effective for capturing fine textures, brushwork, and lighting variations that span small regions. When integrated with the style GAN-like architecture, these multi-scale critics learn to assess both coarse geometry and nuanced textures within the same training loop. Second, regularization and stability mechanisms. Spectral normalization constrains the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator, preventing it from becoming too aggressive and destabilizing the generator. Gradient penalties, such as the R1 penalty on real data or zero-centered penalties in the latent space, enforce smoother gradients and help maintain a healthier training dynamic as networks grow in capacity. In practice, these techniques reduce oscillations during progression through resolutions and keep the feedback signal meaningful across scales. Third, conditioning and auxiliary objectives. Projection discriminators and auxiliary heads allow the discriminator to use style, class, or attribute information. By sharing a representation and projecting onto a style condition space, the critic encourages the generator to respect explicit style cues and to produce transitions that are coherent across variations. This is especially valuable when styles diverge significantly or when you need the model to interpolate between distinct artistic regimes without collapsing diversity. Fourth, feature-based and hybrid signaling. Beyond the final real divided by fake score, many discriminators emit intermediate features that can guide the generator through feature matching or perceptual losses. Hybrid models combine learned discriminators with auxiliary perceptual criteria or contrastive signals, pushing the generator to align high-level representation distributions with those of real images. Such hybrids can improve texture realism while preserving global structure. Fifth, evaluation and monitoring. Realistically, progress is assessed with metrics such as Frechet inception distance, FID, and its kernelized cousin, KID, which measure realism and diversity, not just pixel-wise similarity. Complement these with precision recall analysis for generative models and perceptual metrics like LPAPS to gauge perceptual consistency. Use these tools to guide architectural choices, the number of scales, the weight of auxiliary heads, and the strength of regularizers. In short, modern discriminators blend adaptive multi-scale scrutiny with stability enforcing regularization and stylistic conditioning. The result is a critique that preserves speed and quality while better guiding the generator toward authentic, varied, and controllable imagery. Coming up, we'll pull back the curtain on StyleGAN 2 and why removing progressive growing matters for image quality and stability. With a single fixed resolution from start to finish, the network learns more consistently, textures stay crisper, and training curves stop bouncing around. We'll then unpack the core normalization redesigns and the shift from ADAIN to weight modulation and demodulation, a per-channel tuning that keeps features balanced and cut down on strange patches. You'll hear how injecting noise at the feature level rather than per pixel helps texture resemble real life without introducing new artifacts. We'll connect these changes to three guiding ideas: normalization through modulation, cleaner noise pathways, and a simpler code path for synthesis. Finally, we'll glimpse the practical payoff: sharper details in faces and objects, smoother textures, and more reliable results across scenes as you push the resolution higher. Beyond the surface of StyleGAN 2's single resolution design lies a set of stabilization and evaluation ideas that are highly relevant to researchers aiming for robust, high-fidelity synthesis. First, consider how you would push stability further without reintroducing artifacts. Even though StyleGAN 2 achieves solid fidelity through a fixed resolution and a redesigned normalization scheme, complementary regularization techniques from the GAN literature remain valuable. Spectral normalization on the discriminator and, in some setups, controlled regularization on the generator constrains the Lipschitz constant of the networks, which can reduce gradient explosions and improve generalization when training on very high-resolution data or diverse domains. Gradient penalties, such as R1 or R2 applied to the discriminator, offer another path to smoother loss landscapes and more stable convergence, especially in settings with limited data or when extending to new datasets. These tools can be used selectively to compare stability regimes without changing the core StyleGAN 2 architecture. Second, moving from stability to evaluation, robust metrics are essential for fair comparisons. The Frechet inception distance, FID, remains a workhorse for quantifying distributional similarity between real and generated images, but it should be complemented by additional measures. Kernel inception distance, KEY, provides a bias-reduced alternative, while LPIPS-based perceptual similarity gauges finer texture and detail fidelity. Precision and recall for generative models help diagnose mode collapse versus coverage, and MS-SIM can reveal structural similarity at multiple scales. When reporting results for high-resolution experiments, it is prudent to present per-resolution FIDA, G 2000, 562, 5122, 1024, 2, and if possible, human judgment studies for perceptual quality to mitigate metric biases. Third, look to hybrid or augmented paradigms that extend StyleGAN 2 strengths. Hybrid models combining GAN objectives with diffusion-like refinement steps, variational cues, or vector quantized representations can harvest the best of multiple worlds: sharp textures, stable training, and controllable latent editing. Practically, researchers might explore post-processing refinements, perceptual loss terms, alongside adversarial losses or conditioning schemes that preserve the single resolution stability while offering richer style control. These directions can also serve as robust baselines when assessing novel architectures against StyleGAN 2. Today, I want to connect the concrete changes in StyleGAN 2 to the broader goals of stability, realism, and controllability in synthesis without rehashing the basics. The three threads we'll focus on are per-channel weight modulation with demodulation, redesign normalization, and feature-level noise, and how these choices interact with modern evaluation and hybrid modeling directions. First, per-channel weight modulation and demodulation. The core idea is to give each channel its own influence on the convolutional filters, but in a way that keeps signals balanced as they flow through the network. Demodulation acts as a kind of normalization of the learned weights per channel before they participate in the next convolution. Practically, this curbs channel-wise amplification and suppresses the spurious spikes that can arise when a style injection interacts with deep hierarchical layers. When we couple this with spectral norm-inspired controls on the weight matrices, we obtain a network whose Lipschitz constant across layers remains bounded, reducing the risk of exploding activations or oscillatory dynamics during training. The result is not only crisper textures and fewer late-stage artifacts, but also more predictable behavior as we adjust style intensities. In short, weight modulation tunes the signal path and demodulation tames it, keeping feature maps coherent across the model's depth. Second, the redesigned normalization layers and the shift to feature-level noise. Traditional pixel or per-sample noise injection can introduce misalignments across spatial regions, especially when the generator's normalization path interacts with style signals. By normalizing at the feature level and injecting noise into the feature stream itself, we create controlled micro-variations that are consistent with the learned representations. This improves the realism of fine-grained details while avoiding the smearing artifacts that sometimes accompany Adain-style approaches. Moreover, aligning normalization with the flow of the style condition features fosters stability during training, and it pairs well with path-length style regularization notions that encourage a smooth mapping from latent inputs to perceptual outputs. Beyond these design choices, we now evaluate and extend them with a few advanced directions. Spectral normalization and gradient penalty concepts can be deployed more aggressively on the discriminators to ensure smoother gradients and better generalization, particularly when scaling to higher resolutions or larger datasets. For evaluation, we rely on FID as a broad realism proxy, but we complement it with kernel inception distance, KID, perceptual metrics like LPIPs, and distribution-aware tests, precision divided by recall, to capture diversity and fidelity. Hybrid models blending GANs with diffusion refinements or using multi-scale discriminators offer a promising path to push both global structure and local textures toward even higher realism while retaining training stability guarantees provided by weight modulation, demodulation, and feature-level normalization. Let's build on the specifics you just heard about StyleGAN2's approach to fine detail. The improvements in noise injection and normalization make textures feel tangible, but there are additional higher-level techniques that researchers can leverage to push fidelity even further. I'll outline 3 strands: stabilization techniques, robust evaluation, and hybrid modeling strategies that pair StyleGAN2 with other paradigms. First, stabilization through spectral normalization and related regularization. StyleGAN2 already reduces artifacts with weight demodulation, but stabilizing the training dynamics is still crucial, especially at high resolutions. Spectral normalization constrains the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator and, where appropriate, the generator's layers, helping prevent runaway weight updates that could distort textures or induce spurious correlations across spatial regions. When paired with path length regularization, which encourages a smooth, predictable mapping from the latent space to image space, you get crisper textures that remain consistent across samples and throughout extended training. In practice, you'll see fewer sudden shifts in shading or edge definition as you move through the latent manifold, which translates to more reliable texture transfer and more stable long-form generation. Second, moving from qualitative gains to rigorous evaluation. Pixel-level sharpness is important, but comparative metrics matter for scholarly work. Freshet inception distance, FID, remains a strong generalist proxy for realism, yet it benefits from complementary metrics. Kernel inception distance, KID, to mitigate finite sample bias, and perceptual metrics like LPAPS to quantify texture structure fidelity. For texture-focused work, consider temporal consistency metrics if you are applying these models to video, reduced flicker, and stable texture statistics across frames. Localized texture diagnostics capturing edge sharpness in skin, fabric weave, or hair strands can help validate the practical impact of noise injection refinements and weight demodulation in challenging regions like corners of the mouth or fine strands. Third, hybrid modeling strategies. StyleGAN2 is powerful, but it can be complemented by auxiliary priors and alternative generative influences. Hybrid approaches include incorporating diffusion-based refinements as a post-processing or second stage to capture ultrafine textures while preserving global structure, or integrating transformer blocks to enforce long-range coherence where StyleGAN2's locality dominates. There are also promising directions in jointly training a style GAN backbone with a diffusion model, letting the diffusion component polish textures without sacrificing the generator's controllability. Practically, this means you can retain the crisp, artifact-resistant textures from style GAN 2 while gaining stronger global consistency and texture diversity through diffusion priors. Before we move on, let's connect the dots from ADA to what you'll see next. Today, we focus on how adaptive augmentation helps image generation when data is scarce and what that means in practice. You'll hear how models get sturdier, produce clearer images, and resist overfitting because the discriminator sees a broader yet controlled view of the world. We'll then explore extended usage scenarios, lean datasets in medical imaging where a few scans must suffice, and creative contexts where artists or students can experiment with many styles from a small collection. You'll also see practical steps. Start with a small image set, apply mild adaptive edits, and compare against a non-adaptive baseline to quantify gains. Thank you. Today, we'll deepen the discussion of data efficiency by connecting adaptive discriminator augmentation to a few advanced practice areas that researchers routinely consider when pushing GANs on limited data. ADA is effective because it injects diversity into the discriminator's view of the data, but the real power lies in its adaptivity. The augmentations are not applied at a fixed strength, they are tuned on the fly to match the learning dynamics. If the discriminator starts to memorize or overfit evidence by becoming too adept at telling real from fake on the small training set, the system ramps up augmentation for a while. If, conversely, the model is learning robustly and the discriminator signal is becoming too noisy or unstable, the augmentation is dialed back. This adaptive loop helps the discriminator generalize, which in turn stabilizes the generator toward producing more varied, higher quality images even when data are scarce. When we bring in spectral normalization, we gain a complementary form of regularization. Spectral norm constraints help regulate the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator, damping sharp excursions in gradients. ADA's data-driven augmentations then operate within that stabilized regime, encouraging the discriminator to generalize without overwhelming the network with impossible or irrelevant invariances. In practice, you'll often combine ADA with gradient penalties, such as a WGAN GP style term, to further constrain the discriminator's gradient behavior. The combination can yield a more resilient training signal. ADA broadens the data view, while the gradient penalty guards against pathological gradient flow. Evaluation is central here. Beyond qualitative checks, we rely on metrics like freshet inception distance and, when appropriate, kernel inception distance, chi-ID, to quantify both quality and diversity of generated samples. On small datasets, we monitor how these metrics track during the adaptive cycle and run ablations, comparing fixed augmentation schedules versus adaptive ADA. Precision recall analysis over generated distributions can also reveal whether the model is recovering unseen modes or merely rehashing seen ones. Hybrid models offer another avenue for leveraging ADA. In GAN-based hybrids with diffusion components, for example, adaptive augmentation concepts can be extended to discriminators that judge both raw and augmented views of samples, or to multitask discriminators that enforce consistency across modalities. Even within VAE GAN hybrids, ADA-inspired adaptive augmentation can help the adversarial component avoid overfitting while the reconstruction term preserves structure. Practically, start with a moderate adaptive target for augmentation strength and a conservative update rate. Track FID, gradient norms, and discriminator accuracy on both real and augmented data. If you notice instability or degraded mode coverage, tighten the penalties or temper augmentation. If you see stagnation, allow a bit more adaptive capacity. ADA is a smart helper, not a magic fix, but it offers a principled path to faster, more reliable exploration of ideas with limited data. Adaptive augmentation is more than a tuning knob. It is a feedback-driven controller that keeps the generator honest while expanding its creative space. In practice, ADA monitors how the discriminator responds to the evolving generator and the current augmentation policy. When the discriminator starts to appear too confident, signaling potential overfitting to easy examples, ADA increases augmentation strength to inject more challenging cues. When the discriminator stays suspiciously uncertain or the generator struggles to improve, ADA scales back the edits to preserve stable learning. The result is a dynamic balance. Realism rises without collapsing into memorized patterns, and diversity keeps pace with the generator's capacity to model new variations. Several advanced threads connect ADA to contemporary GAN stabilization and evaluation practice. First, spectral norm and Lipschitz constraints. Modern discriminators often employ spectral normalization to bound weight magnitudes and stabilize gradients. ADA must work in harmony with these constraints. Overly aggressive augmentations can push the discriminator into regimes where the enforced Lipschitz properties are stressed, so the adaptation signal should be tempered by the current spectral characteristics. In practice, one can monitor the discriminator spectral norm alongside augmentation strength and adjust ADA to avoid eroding the tight gradient control that spectral normalization provides. Second, gradient penalties. Techniques like WGAN-GP or R1 divided by R2 penalties regularize the discriminator's gradient, promoting smoother learning. ADA complements them by presenting the discriminator with a broader, more varied view of real and synthetic data. If gradient penalties are already providing strong stabilization, ADA can operate with a smaller augmentation perturbation and still yield gains in diversity. Conversely, when penalties are relaxed or the data distribution is highly multimodal, ADA might supplement them with higher augmentation to maintain a robust learning signal. Third, evaluation metrics and feedback signals. Beyond visual inspection, practitioners increasingly rely on metrics such as Frechet inception distance, kernel inception distance, KIT, and precision divided by recall between real and generated distributions. ADA can be guided by these signals. A plateau or deterioration in FID as training progresses may indicate that augmentations are not fostering useful diversity or that realism is leaking. By tying the adaptation trigger to a short window of FID and diversity metrics, ADA becomes more principled than a purely heuristic schedule. Finally, hybrid models and differentiable augmentation. Incorporating differentiable augmentations or learned augmentation policies can enhance the adaptivity, allowing ADA to fine-tune not only the strength but also the type of edits. This aligns with the goal of training stable, high-fidelity generators that produce a broad yet coherent set of images. As we turn to improving image generation when the dataset is small, the focus shifts from simply generating plausible samples to ensuring stability, diversity, and meaningful generalization under data constraints. In practice, the path forward combines careful regularization, adaptive data augmentation, and targeted evaluation. A core idea is adaptive augmentation. You don't apply a fixed level of augmentation for all training epochs. Instead, you let feedback from the learning signal guide how aggressively you transform inputs. When the model starts to overfit or the discriminator becomes overly dominant, we dial back or tighten augmentation to inject useful variability without distorting the data distribution. Conversely, when learning stalls, we can modestly increase augmentation to expose the generator to broader cues. The result is a data-aware prior that helps the model generalize rather than memorize. To make this robust in small data regimes, we lean on stabilization techniques that have proven effective in limiting overfitting and gradient noise. Spectral normalization is a practical tool for the discriminator. By constraining the spectral norm of its weight matrices, we bound the Lipschitz constant and reduce sensitivity to small data fluctuations. Pair this with gradient penalties such as WGAN-GP or an R1 divided by R2 regularization term to enforce smooth, plausible gradients and discourage sharp, memorized mappings. Together, these help the generator produce realistic samples even when examples are scarce. Evaluation becomes crucial when data are limited. Rely on Frechet inception distance FID with a stable feature extractor, but corroborate with complementary metrics such as kernel inception distance, KID, and perceptual similarity measures like LPAPS. Consider class-wise or dataset-specific FID to avoid unfairly favoring a dominant mode. Beyond numbers, incorporate qualitative audits and, where possible, human judgment. A robust evaluation protocol often includes cross-seed stability checks and reporting variance across multiple training runs. Hybrid modeling offers a route to leverage priors without abandoning the adversarial signal. A VA-GAN hybrid, for example, provides a reconstruction-based prior that guides the generator when data are scarce. Adding a contrastive or perceptual regularization term to the discriminator can also help it learn richer representations that support more diverse outputs. In some cases, lightweight diffusion priors or energy-based components can be fused with GAN objectives to improve sample quality under small sample constraints. Extended usage scenarios, medical imaging, limited art datasets, personalized avatars benefit from these ideas by delivering higher quality, diverse images with fewer labeled examples. Start small, apply mild adaptive augmentation, monitor robust metrics, and compare against a non-adaptive baseline to quantify gains. The takeaway: when data are scarce, stability, diversity, and principled evaluation become the leverage for high-quality generative performance. StyleGAN 3 marks a deliberate shift from sharper images to consistently behaving images under geometric transformations. Building on the aliasing issues we saw in StyleGAN 2, the redesign grounds the generator's operations in signal processing ideas. Treat image information as a flow that remains stable when features move, shift, or rotate. The practical effect is that a face or an object retains its structure and texture even as you translate or rotate it, reducing the spatial distortions that previously appeared as jagged edges or wavy distortions. Beyond the qualitative improvements, there are several advanced avenues researchers routinely discuss to push this further. A core consideration is controlling the model's Lipschitz properties. Spectral normalization is a widely used tool here. By constraining the spectral norms of layers, you bound the network sensitivity to input perturbations. In practice, applying spectral normalization to the discriminator and, where appropriate, to generator components helps stabilize training at high resolutions and curbs the amplification of small transformation-related fluctuations that can re-emerge as artifacts. Relatedly, gradient penalties offer another lever for stability. While StyleGAN training has its own internal regularizers and path length signals, penalties such as the WGA in GP formulation or voxel-wise R1 divided by R2 penalties on the discriminator gradient can further smooth the optimization landscape. The aim is to prevent sharp, non-physical gradients that could otherwise drive the generator toward inconsistent aliasing patterns, especially when the network processes transformed inputs. Evaluation is another axis where we can be more rigorous. In addition to traditional freshet inception distance, researchers increasingly report kernel-based distances like KID and perceptual metrics such as LPAPS to capture both global realism and local texture fidelity. When assessing transformation robustness, one can compute FID divided by LPIPS under controlled shifts, rotations, and multi-frame translations to quantify the degree of invariance in generated samples. Hybrid modeling also offers fertile ground. For example, StyleGAN 3 can serve as a powerful prior within diffusion-based frameworks, guiding global structure while the diffusion process refines texture and details. Conversely, diffusion models can provide broad, stochastic structure that StyleGAN 3 then renders with its transformation-stable inductive biases. In domains like 3D-aware generation, integrating StyleGAN 3 with multi-view consistency modules or NeRF-like components can yield geometry-respecting textures that persist across viewpoints. StyleGAN 2 produced some of the best synthetic images at the time, but researchers quickly noticed recurring flaws. The first was aliasing. This happens when the generator fails to maintain smooth signal flow, leading to small but noticeable distortions in textures such as hair strands, fabric patterns, or sharp edges. These distortions break the illusion of realism. StyleGAN 3 directly addresses this by enforcing strict signal processing principles so that details appear sharper and more natural. Another limitation was translation equivariance. If you shifted an object in the input space, the generated image could change unpredictably. For example, moving a facial feature slightly in the latent space could cause inconsistent lighting or shape distortions. StyleGAN 3 redesigned its convolution layers so that features remain stable under such transformations, which means the same object can be generated consistently even when shifted. Finally, StyleGAN 2 struggled with image consistency during transformations like rotation, scaling, or translation. Features such as eyes or geometric structures could warp or drift when the image was adjusted. StyleGAN 3 resolves this by ensuring that features remain coherent, so objects hold their identity across different poses and movements. Together, these improvements mark a big step toward stable, reliable generative models that can be trusted in applications like film, design, and scientific visualization. Today, we dive into StyleGAN 3 and what sets it apart from its predecessors. The core claim is bold but practical. StyleGAN 3 pushes toward alias-free generation by ensuring the underlying signal stays continuous as it moves through the network. In effect, the generator aims to suppress spatial aliasing artifacts that show up as jagged edges, waviness, or subtle distortions when you sample or resample a scene. The practical consequence is a sequence of images with more coherent textures, steadier lighting, and fewer glitches when you pan across a scene or render frames in a sequence. Two architectural pivots anchor this shift: convolution and normalization. On the convolution side, StyleGAN 3 revisits how the sliding window reads image patches, with a design that improves alignment of features across spatial shifts. The goal is to reduce misalignment that can produce shimmering textures or inconsistent edges when sampling at different scales or viewpoints. On the normalization side, the architecture emphasizes stable feature statistics across the image, helping to prevent local bursts of intensity or darkening that would otherwise break spatial coherence. The net effect is smoother textures, skin, fabric, foliage, whose transitions remain continuous as you move through a scene. Beyond the architectural changes, there is a rich set of techniques researchers bring to bear on training and evaluation. Spectral normalization can constrain the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator and, in some setups, aspects of the generator, contributing to more stable adversarial training and better behaved gradients. Gradient penalties, as in Wasserstein-style objectives, can further stabilize training by encouraging smoother, more meaningful discriminator responses across the data manifold. These tools help ensure that the network does not overfit to tiny aliasing queues and that the learned representations generalize across views and scales. Evaluation is essential here. In addition to qualitative inspection, practitioners increasingly rely on freshet inception distance and kernel inception distance key to quantify distributional similarity to real data, and LPIPS to gauge perceptual similarity between samples. Robustness metrics assessing consistency under translations, rotations, or lighting variations are particularly important for StyleGAN 3's claims about spatial continuity. Multi-view or temporal consistency tests, often complemented by human judgments, provide a more complete picture of the model's stability. Hybrid models offer intriguing possibilities, injecting alias-free priors from StyleGAN 3 into diffusion-based or VQGAN frameworks, or using a StyleGAN 3 backbone as a fast, controllable prior for 3D or NeRF-like reconstructions. In short, StyleGAN 3 represents a careful balance of architectural discipline and empirical evaluation, aiming not only for sharper images but for textures and edges that stay in tune as you move through a scene. It's like tuning a guitar for harmony. When the strings are in tune, the picture feels right. StyleGAN 3 represents more than incremental realism. It embodies a principled shift toward alias-free generation and spatial consistency. In practical terms, you can think of it as moving from texture-level improvements to geometry-aware synthesis. The result is that edges, textures, and fine features align more faithfully as you navigate the image space, whether you rotate, crop, or zoom without the familiar flickers or misaligned stitches that plagued earlier architectures. From a modeling perspective, several advanced design choices underlie these gains. One key axis is stabilizing and constraining the learning dynamics through Lipschitz conscious techniques. Spectral normalization, applied to the discriminator and in some setups to the generator paths, helps keep the network's response within a controlled bound, reducing the risk of explosive high-frequency artifacts. Complementary gradient penalties, such as WGAN, GP, or R1 divided by R2 regularization, enforce smoothness in the discriminator's gradient, which translates into more faithful gradient signals for the generator. Collectively, these measures support a cleaner separation of structure from texture and help the network learn consistent, view-stable representations. Evaluation of these advances goes beyond subjective realism. In practice, we rely on calibrated metrics like freshet inception distance or FID to quantify not just the closeness to real data but the diversity of the generated set. Complementary metrics such as KID, kernel inception distance, and precision recall curves offer a more nuanced picture of mode coverage versus sample quality. Perceptual metrics like LPIPS assess how perceptually close two images are, which matters when you compare views or crops. For 3D-aware and view-consistent generation, researchers increasingly adopt multi-view or rotation-based evaluations to quantify how realism holds up under transformation, not just static frames. Hybrid approaches offer a fertile research avenue. You can combine GAN priors with diffusion or neural rendering components to push both detail and consistency further. For example, Diffusion-guided refinements can clean up residual texture noise while retaining the structured, high-frequency detail that StyleGAN 3 captures. In 3D-aware workflows, integrating neural radiance fields or voxel-based priors with an alias-free generator aligns geometry and appearance across viewpoints, enabling more faithful animations and virtual scenes. Finally, as you push these models in research, balance realism with practical constraints, training and inference cost, data biases, and ethical implications. Use rigorous multimetric evaluation, disclose limitations under transformations, and frame your claims about realism in a transparent, reproducible way. We'll start by meeting Z, the reservoir of noise that seeds every image, and then travel through the mapped worlds called W and W+, where edits become more predictable and layered. Think of W+ as giving each layer its own dial, letting you tint hair, lighting, texture, all without wrecking the whole face. As we explore, you'll hear how intermediate latent spaces slowly tweak patterns inside the network carefully enough to preserve structure while steering style. We'll then mix and interpolate styles, blend broad poses with fine textures, and imagine practical workflows from portraits to animation. Finally, we'll ground all this in responsible use, ethics, and how these tools can empower artists while staying mindful of bias and privacy. Expect quick demos, misconceptions addressed, and a map for responsible experimentation. Latent spaces in StyleGAN give us a controllable, semantically meaningful handle on how an image is formed, but there is more beneath the surface that researchers can leverage. Z is our starting noise, the raw variation you can't edit directly. We move from Z to W to gain a stable, learned encoding where edits tend to be more predictable. W+ further extends this by allowing per layer style modulation, so each layer of the generator can carry its own style, think adjusting hair color in one layer and lighting in another. This layered control is what enables fine-grained manipulation while preserving the overall structure of the face or scene. From a research perspective, there are two important directions to push this further. First, stability and fidelity during editing. Even with disentangled directions, pushing too far along a latent path can cause unintended drift in other attributes. Techniques that have become standard in GAN training spectral normalization on the discriminator to enforce Lipschitz continuity and gradient penalties like WJA-GP or R1 divided by R2 penalties help maintain a healthier optimization landscape. When you combine these with careful regularization of the embedding spaces, the consequences of moving along a direction become more predictable and edits remain local to the intended attributes. Second, robust evaluation and inversion. FID remains a useful yardstick for realism and diversity, but it's not sufficient for edit quality. Complement FID with perceptual metrics such as LPIPS to gauge how much a specified attribute changes, and with attribute-specific probes or classifiers to quantify disentanglement and preservation of unrelated features. Remember to monitor drift across successive edits and maintain identity or pose constraints where relevant. In practice, you'll often map real images into the latent family GAN inversion to edit them. This hybrid workflow, real image W plus divided by encoder, latent edit generator, output benefits from both the expressive latent spaces and post-hoc refinement. We can also discuss hybrid models at the modeling level. Encoders paired with generators provide end-to-end invertibility, enabling real image editing within the W or W plus framework. Hybrid approaches that fuse GANs with diffusion-like refinements can yield the best of both worlds: the fast, controllable edits of latent directions and the high-fidelity, texture-rich details from diffusion-like steps. In practice, you pick an editing aim, trace its semantic direction in the latent space, and move along it with calibrated steps. You test multiple directions, use auxiliary metrics to track realism and attribute preservation, and iterate. The result is a map of editable, semantically meaningful directions, multi-layered, disentangled, and ready for rapid exploration and rigorous evaluation. Let me extend this discussion with practical mechanisms for stabilizing, evaluating, and expanding style mixing in research settings. We'll move beyond the idea of simply swapping coarse and fine features to how we diagnose quality, control, robustness, and push the boundaries with hybrid approaches. First, stabilization and regularization matter as soon as you start mixing styles across different layers. Spectral normalization, applied to convolution layers, helps cap the Lipschitz constant of the generator and discriminator, reducing the risk of abrupt feature leakage when you blend coarse poses with fine textures. Pair this with a gradient penalty mindset borrowed from WGAN GP. Enforce a small penalty on gradients with respect to real and generated samples, which promotes smoother transitions during interpolation and reduces artifacts when you traverse latent directions that combine disparate styles. You can also leverage path length regularization, as in StyleGAN, to encourage consistent perceptual changes as you interpolate. These tools don't replace good data and architecture design, but they give you a kinder optimization landscape when exploring hybrid styles. Second, let's talk evaluation. In addition to conventional FID and KID scores, incorporate perceptual and traversal metrics that are sensitive to style mixing. Use LPPS to quantify perceptual distance between successive interpolation frames, ensuring smooth, non-jittery transitions. Track the Frechet audiovisual analogs for image domains if relevant, and monitor mode coverage with precision divided by recall metrics. For style mixing specific insight, compute semantic consistency scores across mixes. How often does swapping coarse attributes preserve the intended fine details, and vice versa? You can also map latent directions via controlled traversals A, G, along a coarse direction while holding a fine direction fixer, and quantify how independent the factors are. Reporting a small set of representative interpolations alongside aggregate metrics clarifies what the model actually achieves. Third, consider hybrid models and richer latent representations. You can fuse StyleGAN-like generators with diffusion priors or VAE-based encoders to improve disentanglement between coarse and fine factors. Hybrid training can yield more stable latent spaces, where coarse manipulations remain meaningful when you layer on different textures. Orthogonal or disentangled regularization, such as imposing approximate independence between coarse and fine latent subspaces, helps prevent crosstalk that blurs the intended mix. Fourth, practical workflow tips. Build a library of coarse style directions, poses lighting, and fine style directions, textures, color palettes. Use linear or nonlinear interpolation to explore the space, and validate results with a small set of human or criterion-based checks. Start with 2 easy styles and a clear goal, then progressively introduce more components. When presenting results, explain the rationale behind each blend so your audience can follow how a particular change propagates through both the coarse and fine layers. Building on StyleGAN style control, today I'll take you a bit deeper into how we reason about editing, stabilizing, and evaluating these powerful generative systems. The goal is not only to edit precisely, but to reason about quality, reliability, and responsible use in research and practice. First, let's talk about stability and fidelity in editing. Beyond latent sliders, modern practice employs techniques that constrain and shape the generator's behavior. Spectral normalization constrains the Lipschitz constant of the discriminator and invariance of StyleGAN lineage helps prevent erratic updates that can degrade identity preservation during editing. Relatedly, gradient penalties such as R1 divided by R2 encourage smoother, more controllable gradients, which helps when you perform fine-grained attribute manipulations in high-dimensional latent spaces. A complementary tool is path length regularization, which aligns changes in latent space with perceptual changes in image space. Together, these regularizers stabilize training and make per-attribute edits more predictable, so moving a slider for age or expression yields a consistent visual outcome without introducing artifacts or drifting identity. Second, robust evaluation is essential as we push toward finer control. The Frechet inception distance, or FID, remains a cornerstone for assessing overall image quality and diversity, but it should be complemented by perceptual metrics like LPIPS to quantify how changes in a latent direction translate into perceptual shifts. For editing, directional metrics that probe whether a given latent axis corresponds to a targeted attribute are valuable. Identity preservation metrics, often cosine similarity in a learned embedding space, help quantify how well the subject's identity remains when we say modify age or hairstyle. In practice, researchers report FID across the full range of edits and track how much identity remains stable as attributes are altered. Third, the editing toolkit has grown richer. Beyond global style transfer, per-layer control enables selective edits. Early layers steer course structure. Later layers fine-tune textures and accessories. W and W plus spaces grant different degrees of disentanglement. W Plus can enable more nuanced edits but may risk entanglement if pushed too far. Style mixing, adaptive instance normalization, and stochastic noise maps allow a blend of global appearance with local detail. Hybrid approaches combining StyleGAN-like generators with diffusion steps, or using an encoder to map real images into latent codes enhance invertibility and practical editing of real-world photographs while preserving high fidelity. Finally, we must acknowledge responsible use. As tools become more capable, we need rigorous dataset governance, transparent provenance, and clear ethical boundaries, especially for identity, consent, and privacy. In research, we can incorporate bias analyzers and guardrails into experimental pipelines, ensuring that style control advances knowledge without compromising safety. As we move beyond the introduction, we'll unpack 3 real-world uses that show how StyleGAN accelerates creativity across fields, turning quick sketches into convincing visuals for art projects, streamlining fashion prototypes and virtual try-ons, and shaping dynamic characters and environments for games and films. You'll see how speed, customization, and realism come together to reach audiences faster. But with great realism comes responsibility. We'll examine privacy risks, the threat of deepfakes, and the safeguards needed, transparency, consent, and robust detection tools alongside practical ethics for classrooms and studios. Finally, we'll look ahead at what's next, cross-domain generation that blends art and design, easier user controls, and open, accessible tools that invite broader participation. Across these themes, we'll balance curiosity with critical thinking and responsible practice. Thank you for joining me. Building on the GAN foundations you've already seen, today I want to center on 3 real-world use cases for StyleGAN and then discuss some advanced ideas that researchers are actively exploring to push quality, reliability, and applicability even further. First, artists, advertisers, and entertainment studios are increasingly able to generate convincing images at speed, enabling rapid ideation and iteration. StyleGAN lets teams explore a wide range of visual concepts from mood boards to poster compositions and social assets without starting from scratch on every frame. The results can be highly realistic and highly customizable, matching brand colors, typography, cues, and stylistic sensibilities. This accelerates the creative briefing phase, supports client reviews, and frees artists to focus on higher-level direction rather than pixel-level toil. Importantly, it's not about replacing human judgment, but about expanding the design space and enabling faster feedback loops. Second, fashion and design stand to gain substantially from simulation and virtual try-on capabilities. StyleGAN can generate numerous clothing prototypes in parallel, supporting rapid prototyping and material exploration. When paired with differentiable rendering and fit simulators, it becomes feasible to preview how garments drape and appear on virtual avatars. Virtual try-on features let customers visualize outfits on themselves before purchase, potentially shortening design cycles and reducing marketing spend. For brands, this translates into more agile product development and more personalized, data-driven merchandising. Third, character design and animation are becoming more dynamic in games and film. Creators can craft personalized avatars with diverse outfits and expressive repertoires, while environments can be populated with photorealistic textures and props. The result is richer storytelling and higher user engagement, since audiences encounter more believable characters and responsive worlds. In practice, teams often integrate StyleGAN outputs with animation pipelines, ensuring that generated visual align with narrative briefs and continuity constraints. Behind these outcomes lie advances in training stability and evaluation. Techniques such as spectral normalization help constrain the discriminator's Lipschitz constant, improving convergence, gradient penalties A, G. R1 divided by R2 style terms further stabilize real divided by fake gradient behavior, and path length regularization guides the mapping from latent space to image space for smoother, more controllable edits. When it comes to judging realism and diversity, metrics like Frechet inception distance and kernel-based distances provide quantitative benchmarks who were not an HASSEST and DL complemented by human evaluators for perceptual truth and novelty. Researchers also pursue hybrid models and refinements, combining GAN priors with diffusion refinements or incorporating differentiable rendering and 3D-aware representations to enforce multi-view and geometric consistency. Finally, as we deploy these capabilities, we must prioritize responsible use, bias mitigation, privacy considerations, and transparent review of outputs. Engaging interdisciplinary teams and maintaining ethical guidelines will ensure that the rapid progress in style GAN translates into trustworthy, impactful visual culture. Thank you for the opportunity to dig into the layer beyond the basics. The same capability that lets StyleGAN render convincing images also drives a spectrum of risks that demand rigorous measurement, robust safeguards, and accountable use. To navigate this space, we can lean on three pillars: principled evaluation and control, advanced stabilization techniques, and responsible governance that pairs technical safeguards with policy and education. First, robust evaluation is essential. Realism alone is not sufficient. We need metrics that capture fidelity, diversity, and potential misalignment with real-world use. Beyond FID, we should employ KID, kernel, inception distance, precision recall variance for generative models, and perceptual path length measures to quantify consistency across edits. Importantly, these metrics should be complemented by human perceptual studies and task-based evaluations such as downstream phase verification or object identity consistency test to understand how synthetic content might perform in real decision environments. We should also report uncertainty and confidence intervals, acknowledging biases in datasets and evaluators. Second, stabilization and controllability through advanced training techniques reduce failure modes that enable misuse. Spectral normalization helps constrain the Lipschitz constant of discriminators, improving training stability and making the learning signal more reliable across scales. Gradient penalties, as in WGAN-GP, encourage smoother, more meaningful gradients, reducing mode collapse and enabling finer control over style and attributes. In practice, these techniques promote more predictable outputs and safer exploration of latent spaces, which is crucial when scaling models or deploying them in sensitive domains. Third, hybrid and controllable modeling approaches offer pathways to balance realism with safeguards. Hybrid models that combine diffusion processes with GAN-like components can inherit the strengths of both the stability and diversity of diffusion alongside efficient sampling. Conditioning mechanisms and explicit content filters can enforce ethical constraints restricting certain attributes, domains, or contexts. Moreover, model fingerprinting and watermarking, along with provenance metadata and cryptographic signing, provide traceable evidence of origin, aiding detection and accountability without compromising user privacy. On detection and policy, we should advance detectors that are fast, accurate, and privacy-preserving, including frequency domain and artifact-based classifiers, while recognizing their limits. Governance should pair clear use guidelines with consent frameworks, data minimization, and privacy protections G. DP-efficient training. Media literacy remains essential. Educate researchers and the public about signs of manipulation and the frameworks we rely on to evaluate authenticity. Looking ahead, StyleGAN will increasingly work across domains, and that progress won't be just about prettier pictures. Cross-domain generation will knit together art, fashion, and design in productive ways. Imagine a system that can translate a photograph into a painterly style, then adapt that style to a garment or a print, or conversely turn a textile motif into a gallery-ready image. To realize this, we will rely on domain-robust representations and alignment techniques tools that help the model respect both the visual language of art and the practical constraints of fashion. Techniques such as clip-guided steering and cross-domain fine-tuning will help maintain perceptual coherence when moving between domains. In practice, this requires attention to the training signal beyond traditional GAN losses, spectral normalization to stabilize the discriminator, and gradient penalties, as in WGAN-GP, to enforce smooth, well-behaved gradients. These stability improvements become especially valuable when we fuse styles across very different visual regimes or when we operate under limited paid data. Second, controllability will become more fine-grained and user-friendly. Beyond simple shape or lighting sliders, researchers are pushing toward disentangled latent spaces where semantic factors pose texture, granularity, material properties, and even lighting direction are manipulable with predictable edits. We'll see more robust invertibility, so real images can be mapped to latent codes with minimal loss, enabling precise real-time editing. Hybrid approaches will help here. Lightweight encoders feeding into StyleGAN with diffusion-based refinements or conditional modules that ground edits in a differentiable rendering layer. The result is a workflow where researchers and designers navigate a latent space with meaningful directions and collaborate with the model as a co-creator rather than as a distant generator. Third, accessibility and responsible use will broaden who can experiment with these tools. Open source releases, modular interfaces, and low-code platforms will empower students, artists, and smaller studios to prototype ideas and build demonstrations. But as capabilities grow, so do responsibilities. Clear labeling of synthetic content, consent-aware use of faces, privacy protections, and bias-aware deployment. We'll need practical guidelines and governance to ensure that remixing ideas stays creative without harming individuals or communities. Finally, evaluation will advance in parallel. We'll supplement FID with KID, LPAPS for perceptual similarity and domain-specific metrics, plus FED for temporal coherence when extending to video-like synthesis. In short, the future of style GAN lies in robust cross-domain fidelity, interpretable controls, accessible tooling, and principled ethics together, enabling sophisticated, responsible exploration across art, fashion, and beyond. To close, this deck has shown that effective learning travels from a clear big idea to concrete action. The big idea explains why the topic matters, followed by 3 transferable takeaways you can apply now. Surprising insights shift how you see the topic and help connect theory to daily practice. Finally, the framework invites you to extend these lessons beyond classrooms into future jobs planning. First, gathering evidence, sharing ideas, testing small changes, and measuring results. A quick exercise: write the big idea and 3 takeaways. Plan a tiny action this week and share what you learned with a friend. Key habits: rewrite takeaways in your own words. Link each takeaway to a small action, schedule it, and review progress after a week. Remember, practice, not perfection. Small steps build lasting competence. Let's unpack the arc traced by StyleGAN from its core idea of style-based synthesis to the refined capabilities researchers now rely on. At its heart, the approach separates what to draw from how to draw it by introducing a mapping from a latent code to per-layer style signals that modulate the generator's behavior. A small Z input is transformed into an intermediate W, and each convolution layer receives a conditioning vector that steers, scale, and bias. In practice, this is realized through adaptive normalization mechanisms that act like style-aware controls over features, enabling nuanced effects, lighting, textures, and stroke-like qualities without changing the overall geometry. Style-based modulation thus gives us layered control. Early layers can shape global structure, intermediate layers govern mid-frequency textures, and later layers refine micro details. StyleGAN 3 sharpened the emphasis on rendering fidelity by addressing aliasing and glitches that can arise during sampling and transformations. Alias-free rendering means edges and patterns remain stable under resampling and camera-like transformations, reducing sharp, fake-looking artifacts and improving consistency across views and scales. This stability pays dividends in both single-image quality and multi-image coherence, which matters for datasets with varied viewpoints and a broad class of subjects. Progressive layering remains a practical backbone. We build an image in stages from rough geometry to color blocks to fine textures, while style mixing allows cross-pollination of traits. You can graft hairstyle from one image onto the head of another or blend lighting cues across sources, achieving controlled diversity without sacrificing realism. Disentanglement efforts in successive variants further separate factors like pose, lighting direction, and texture, enabling targeted edits without unintended side effects. Resolution gains up to high-detail portraits and complex backgrounds, accompanied by more robust training dynamics, broaden the scope of application while keeping the learning process tractable. Beyond architecture, researchers now routinely bring in stabilization and evaluation tools that raise the bar for scientific rigor. Spectral normalization and gradient penalties in discriminator or auxiliary critics help enforce Lipschitz continuity and reduce training oscillations. Metrics like Frechet inception distance quantify how closely the generated distribution matches real data, while LPIPS, MSSSIM, and perceptual path length measures give insight into realism, diversity, and smooth latent mappings. Hybrid approaches combining the strengths of GANs with diffusion or vector quantized autoencoders are explored to push fidelity and control even further, often embedding the style-based generator within broader generative pipelines. In short, StyleGAN's evolution shows a disciplined balance: richer control and stability, improved resolution, and principled evaluation, all while preserving learnability and transferability of design blocks. As we look ahead, the takeaway is clear. Architectural refinement, coupled with robust training signals and thoughtful evaluation, enables researchers to push the boundary between artistic expressiveness and scientific rigor, with mindful attention to ethics and safe deployment. StyleGAN didn't just raise the bar for image quality, it reframed what we need from a research workflow: stability, availability, and the ability to combine ideas from different models. In practice, this means moving beyond make it look good to understanding how the generator and discriminator behave as we push resolution, conditioning, and style mixing. A few advanced threads are especially fruitful for researchers and scholars. First, consider training stability and fidelity at scale. Spectral normalization constrains the discriminator's spectral norm, helping keep its power in check as we scale up architectures or datasets. Gradient penalties, think WGANGP style penalties, or R1 divided by R2 regularizers, offer another route towards smoother optimization landscapes, reducing artifacts and mode collapse when we experiment with new conditioning signals or multi-scale discriminators. StyleGAN's own lineage has also benefited from targeted techniques like path length regularization and the truncation trick, which modulate latent space geometry and sampling diversity. These tools are not mere tricks, they are principled levers that shape how small changes in the latent code translate into perceptual changes in the image. Second, robust evaluation is essential to move from pretty results to reproducible signs. The field routinely uses FID, fresh eye inception distance, to quantify how close the generated distribution is to the real data in a learned feature space. Lower FID generally indicates higher realism and diversity is less than #0. 5 hash is greater than kernel inception distance KAD, provides an unbiased alternative, while LPIPS measures perceptual similarity to gauge diversity across samples. Other metrics, such as precision divided by recall for generative models or perceptual path length, help diagnose mode coverage and latent space smoothness. It's important to use a small battery of metrics and to consider their limitations. FID can be sensitive to dataset biases, image resolution, or tonality, so report multiple indicators and, when possible, qualitative assessments from domain experts. Third, the future often lies in hybrid paradigms. Several researchers are stitching together the strengths of GANs with diffusion models or VAEs to improve sampling speed, stability, or controllability. Conditioning strategies via clip, textual prompts, or attribute vectors can be embedded within a StyleGAN framework to steer style and content without sacrificing image fidelity. Hybrid models with multi-scale discriminators or perceptual losses can yield richer textures while preserving global coherence. In parallel, careful ablations on spectral normalization, gradient penalties, and regularization terms help us understand what each component contributes to the final image quality and generalization. In short, StyleGAN opened a toolbox. Use stabilization methods, rigorous evaluation, and thoughtful hybrids to push the boundaries of what these models can reliably achieve in real-world art and research projects. Keep thorough notes, compare alternatives, and share findings to accelerate collective learning. This notebook takes us into the powerful world of StyleGAN 3 and Clip, two of the most advanced tools in generative AI. StyleGAN 3 is known for creating some of the most realistic and detailed images ever produced by a machine, from lifelike portraits to surreal scenes. Clip, on the other hand, connects images with natural language, allowing a model to understand not just what's in a picture, but how it can be described in words. When combined, these two models open up extraordinary creative possibilities. With just a few words as a prompt, you can guide the AI to generate images that reflect your vision, whether it's an abstract concept, a realistic portrait, or something entirely new. It's like having a creative partner who can take your ideas and instantly bring them to life. This notebook is more than code, it's an exploration of how AI can collaborate with human creativity. It shows how machines can interpret, refine, and generate visuals that capture both style and meaning. It also invites us to think about bigger questions. What does it mean to create with AI? How can these tools shape art and design? And what new forms of expression might emerge? This section begins with a comment indicating that it is used to check the type of GPU available in the current environment. It provides a helpful reminder that if the GPU isn't suitable for the tasks at hand, the user might need to perform a factory reset of the runtime to switch to a different GPU. The comments list various GPU models along with their relative performance ratings. The NVIDIA V100 is highlighted as excellent, but it notes that this is only available for Colab Pro users. The P100 is described as very good, the T4 as good, and the preferred choice for most tasks, while the K80 is considered mediocre, and the P4 is marked as not recommended. Finally, the code executes the command NVIDIA SMI L, which lists all the GPUs available in the current environment. This command outputs the details of the detected GPUs, allowing the user to identify exactly which model is being used. This information helps in understanding the computational resources at hand and deciding if they are suitable for the deep learning tasks planned. This section begins with the installation of essential libraries, which is a crucial step because it ensures that the environment has all the necessary tools to run the subsequent code smoothly. The first command upgrades and installs specific versions of PyTorch and Torch Vision, optimized for CUDA 11.1, which provides GPU acceleration. This careful version specification helps maintain compatibility and performance. Next, the code clones the StyleGAN3 repository from NVIDIA's official GitHub page, giving access to the latest StyleGAN3 codebase for generating high-quality images. Similarly, it clones the clip repository from OpenAI, which is used for connecting images and text via a shared embedding space. After cloning, it installs the clip package in editable mode, allowing for modifications if needed, and then installs additional utility libraries like INOPS for tensor operations and Ninja for building extensions efficiently. Following the installations, the script appends the cloned repositories to Python's system path, making their modules easily importable. Then, it imports a series of standard libraries such as sys, os, time, and glob for system operations, along with pickle for data serialization, shootil for file operations, and numpy for numerical computations. It also imports image processing libraries like PIL for handling images, PyTorch for deep learning functionalities, and Torch Vision transforms for image pre-processing. The clip model itself is imported, and some additional modules for text normalization and regular expressions are included. Overall, this setup phase prepares the environment with all the necessary tools and libraries to perform advanced image synthesis and manipulation tasks using StyleGAN3 and clip. This section begins with a comment indicating that saving images directly to Google Drive is an optional step. It explains that by copying the generated images to Drive, you can work with them more efficiently, especially since accessing files from Drive tends to be faster than downloading them directly from Colab. The code then imports the necessary module from Google Colab to enable this functionality. Specifically, it mounts your Google Drive to the runtime environment, making your Drive's files accessible through the file system. The command drive mount content divided by drive prompts you to authorize access, allowing the notebook to read and write files within your drive. It's important to note that for this to work smoothly, you need to have a folder named samples already created inside your Google Drive. This setup ensures that the generated images can be stored in the correct location, making future access and management easier during your project. This section begins with defining some essential functions that will be used throughout the notebook. The first function, fetch, is designed to retrieve data from a given URL or local file path. It checks if the input string starts with HTTP or HTTP indicating a web address. If so, it makes an HTTP GET request to fetch the content, raises an error if the request fails, and then writes the content into an in-memory bytes buffer, which is written for further use. If the input isn't a URL, it simply opens the specified file in binary read mode from the local file system. The second function, fetch model, is tailored for loading pre-trained models. It takes a URL or path as input and determines the appropriate file name to use. If the input contains Drive, Google, it checks for specific shared Google Drive IDs to assign meaningful local file names, such as wikiat1024 stylegan3t17 to me.mg, pkltree, or lhq256 stylegan325, meme pklpring. If the input is not from Google Drive, it extracts the file name from the URL using .os, path, base name. The function then checks if this file already exists locally. If it does, it simply returns the file name, avoiding re-downloading. Otherwise, it proceeds to download the model. For non-Google Drive links, it uses wget to download the file. If the source is Google Drive, it extracts the file ID from the URL and uses .gdown to fetch the file directly from Google Drive. This setup ensures that models are downloaded efficiently and stored with consistent file names for subsequent use. This section begins by highlighting the importance of selecting a pre-trained model for our project. It presents a list of available options, each trained on different types of images, such as human faces from the FFHQ dataset, paintings and portraits from Medfaces, animal faces from AFHQV2, cosplay images by a specific artist, as well as artworks from WikiArt and landscapes from the LHQ dataset. The code then defines a base URL pointing to NVIDIA's model repository, which hosts various versions of StyleGAN 3. We set a variable called model to one of these options. By default, it's set to FFHQ, but it can be changed to any of the listed datasets. Following that, there's a dictionary called model name, that maps each model name to its corresponding download URL. For example, selecting FFHQ points to the pre-trained weights for human face generation, while Medfaces links to the dataset of painted portraits. Other options include animal faces, cosplay images, artwork, and landscapes, each hosted at their respective URLs. The comment reminds us to rerun this cell if we decide to switch models, ensuring that the correct pre-trained weights are loaded for our chosen dataset. This setup allows us to easily switch between different styles and domains by simply changing the model variable, making the process flexible and straightforward. This section of the code begins with defining parameters for the image generation process. The first parameter, texts, is a prompt that guides the image creation, and it can include multiple prompts separated by the pipe character, allowing for combined or blended guidance. This flexibility enables users to experiment with different concepts or styles within a single generation process. Next, the steps parameter specifies how many optimization iterations the process should run. Increasing the number of steps generally results in a more refined and accurate image, but also requires more computation time. The seed parameter sets the randomness seed, which is crucial for reproducibility. Using the same seed and prompt will typically generate similar images each time. If the seed is set to -1, the code randomly generates a seed value, ensuring a different result with each run. The code then checks if the seed is -1. If so, it generates a random seed using numpy's that randin function and prints out this value, allowing users to note it down for future reproducibility if desired. Subsequently, the code processes the text's input by splitting it at each pipe character, stripping any white space, and filtering out empty strings. This results in a list of individual prompts. For each of these prompts, the code uses the clip model's text embedding function to convert the prompts into numerical representations that the model can work with. These embeddings, stored in the targets list, serve as the guidance vectors for the image generation process, anchoring the output to the semantic content of the prompts. This section of the code is dedicated to executing the model, effectively running the image generation process based on a given prompt. It begins by defining a pre-processing pipeline called TF, which resizes images to 224 by 224 pixels and then scales the pixel values from the range -11 to 0, 1, ensuring that the images are properly normalized for further processing. The core function run takes a timestring parameter, which could be used for timestamping or logging purposes. Inside this function, a fixed random seed is set for reproducibility. The process starts by initializing the generation with a set of random latent vectors, which serve as the starting points for image synthesis. To find the best image that matches the prompt, the code samples multiple latent vectors, 8 in this case, by mapping random noise through the generator's mapping network. Each latent vector is normalized relative to the average latent and standard deviation, ensuring consistent scaling. These latent vectors are then transformed into images via the synthesis network. Next, each generated image is embedded using a clip-based embedding function, which converts the images into a feature space suitable for comparison with the prompt. The code computes a loss between these image embeddings and the target prompt embeddings, measuring how close each image is to the desired concept. The image with the lowest loss, meaning the closest match, is selected, and its corresponding latent vector and loss value are stored is less than #0. 5. After processing all samples, the code stacks the selected latent vectors and their associated losses. Although not shown here, this setup typically leads to further optimization or visualization steps, aiming to produce an image that best aligns with the prompt. Overall, this process efficiently searches for the most prompt-relevant image by sampling multiple candidates and selecting the best match. This section of the notebook focuses on saving generated images into a compressed archive. It begins with a comment indicating that a tar file will be created inside the samples directory and will be automatically downloaded unless the user has previously set up a Google Drive connection, in which case the archive will be saved directly to the Drive's samples folder. The code then prompts the user to specify an optional archive name through a string input, which is processed using a slugify function to ensure it is a valid file name. If the user provides a custom name, the archive will be named accordingly. Otherwise, it defaults to using a timestamp stored in the variable timestring. Next, the code creates a tar archive containing the images from the samples timestring folder. This is achieved with the tar command, which packages all the images into a single archive file located in the samples directory named after the chosen or default timestamp. Finally, the script checks whether a Google Drive samples directory exists. If it does, it copies the newly created archive into the directory for persistent storage. If not, it triggers a download of the archive directly to the user's local machine, ensuring easy access to the generated images. This process streamlines the management and retrieval of generated samples, whether working locally or within a cloud environment. This section of the code is focused on generating a video from a sequence of generated image frames. It begins by listing all the files in the specified samples directory corresponding to the current timestamp, and then counts how many of those files are JPEG images. This count determines the total number of frames available for video creation. The starting frame is set to 1, meaning the video will begin from the first generated image, but this can be adjusted as needed. The last frame is set to the total number of frames detected, but again, this can be changed to specify a different endpoint. If the number of the last frame exceeds the available frames, an error will occur, so it's important to ensure that the frame number exists. Next, the code defines minimum and maximum frames per second, which will control the playback speed of the resulting video. It calculates the total number of frames to be included by subtracting the initial frame from the last frame. The desired length of the video in seconds is specified, and the file name for the output video is taken from user input with a slugify function applied to ensure it's a valid file name. If no name is provided, it defaults to video. There's commented out code that hints at how individual frames might be loaded into a list, which could be used for more detailed processing or customization. But in this snippet, the focus remains on calculating the appropriate frames per second. The frame rate is computed by dividing the total number of frames by the desired video length, then clipped to stay within the specified minimum and maximum FPS bounds. This ensures the video plays at a smooth, reasonable speed, whether it's very short or very long. This section begins with a comment indicating that it handles the process of downloading a video. It mentions that if the option to save directly to Google Drive is activated, the video will be stored there. To prevent overwriting files with the same name, the code adds a unique identifier to each file name. The process starts by defining a variable for the video file name, which is initially an empty string. This string is then processed through a function called slugify, which cleans up the file name, making it safe for use in file systems by removing or replacing problematic characters. If, after this processing, the file name remains empty, it defaults to a generic name video. Next, the code checks if a specific directory exists within Google Drive, namely drive divided by my drive divided by samples. If this directory exists, it searches for existing files that match the intended file name pattern, specifically MP4 videos with the same base name. It counts how many such files are present to determine if there's a need to append an index to the new file name, ensuring uniqueness. If matching files are found, it creates a new file name by appending the count. Otherwise, it uses the base name directly. Finally, the code copies the generated video file from the local samples directory to the Google Drive samples folder, renaming it appropriately to avoid conflicts. If the Google Drive directory doesn't exist, it defaults to prompting a direct download of the video to the user's local machine using the files download function. This approach smoothly handles both saving to cloud As we wrap up this notebook, we've seen how StyleGAN 3 and Clip destination and machine precision. StyleGAN 3 gives us the ability to generate stunning the layer of guidance that connects those visuals to our ideas and words. Together, they create a system. It collaborates with us to shape them. This journey has shown how prompts, styles, and subtle tweaks can guide the process, turning abstract ideas into visuals that feel alive. It highlights the exciting role AI can play in creativity, not as a replacement, but as a partner that expands what's possible. Beyond the code and outputs, what matters most is the vision this points to. A future where powerful tools like these make art creation more accessible, more experimental, and more personal. We are only scratching the surface of what's possible, and each experiment sparks new ideas about where this technology could lead, whether in art, design, research, or storytelling. As you move forward, I've already shared the code for this notebook in Teams. Please execute it on your end and let me know if you run into any issues. I'll be happy to guide you through.